This just in, the Supreme Court invalidated the Trump-era ban on bump stocks Friday, effectively annulling the nationwide ban on the devices, which allows users of semi-automatic weapons to fire hundreds of rounds per minute. The court ruled along ideological lines. The Trump administration implemented the ban in 2017 after the deadly Las Vegas shooting, in which the shooter used a bump stock to kill 58 people and wound hundreds of others.
In a 6-3 decision, the court maintained the classification as an impermissible reading of the law, ruling in favor of the challenger, Michael Cargill. Cargill is an Austin-based gun store owner, and he challenged the bump stock ban after surrendering two in 2019. The case did not implement the Second Amendment, but instead posited if classifying bump stocks like machine guns was going too far. And so, Amber, we're seeing a ruling across ideological lines. This is something, we've covered on the show before. And I'm a leftist, but I'm definitely on the side of this was a good ruling. I think there are a lot of people on the left who are very vocal, advocates for greater gun control. And I am someone who grew up in a working class family, and I've seen what happens when you're as safe as you make yourselves. There's no one who's going to come who's a good guy from the government to protect you. And in fact, there are a lot of examples in history when it's the opposite, and it's the government doing things that infringe upon our freedoms and, commit acts of violence. And so we have a right to bear arms, yes, to prevent against a tyrannical government. A lot of people like to point out that the military has many more weapons than us. And I'm of the perspective, okay, so don't make the weapons we do have less effective if it comes to that. And it sounds extreme, like we're not at a point of civil war, you're never going to win a war against the government. But I'm just in that position of we do have to live in fear a little bit because of how the working class is treated in America by so many people. We don't want our guns to be taken away.
Well, and I don't think we can simultaneously praise the American Revolution and then say, oh, but, we would never do that, and we certainly don't need the guns to do that. I mean, that was a huge reason why the Second Amendment was enshrined in the Constitution and the Bill of Rights anyway. But I completely agree with you. I think it's important for people to understand that this was not an act of Congress that banned bump stocks. This was a rulemaking procedure by the ATF under the Trump administration that didn't say that bump stocks are banned by just the nature of being bump stocks, but actually reclassified them as machine guns and reclassified the weapons that have bump stocks on them as machine guns. And this is just a complete misunderstanding of what bump stocks actually do. They don't change the mechanics of the gun. They don't change the way that the gun actually fires bullets. It's still a single trigger pull for each bullet that's fired from a semi-automatic weapon. What the bump stock does is it just basically rocks the gun back and forth, so you're able to pull the trigger faster than you would be if you just had your gun without the bump stock. But there are some professional shooters who are capable of firing the weapons as fast as a bump stock allows them to fire them. People have demonstrated that you can use your belt loop as an effective bump stock. So again, this doesn't actually make the gun a machine gun. It doesn't make the gun fully automatic. It just allows you to potentially fire faster if you're not someone who is professionally trained and is capable of doing it without a bump stock. Because it did not change the mechanics of the gun to require or to make it so that just one trigger pull leads to an infinite number of bullets coming out, then it was wrong for the ATF to try to reclassify these devices as machine guns, and that's where the Supreme Court came down on this.
Right. A lot of the common sense gun reform that's advocated for things like background checks, ensuring all guns are registered, and there's no ghost guns. A lot of these things are pretty popular. But I think some of the understandings of how guns actually work is getting in the way of some of the gun control legislation from being common sense, because anyone who uses a handgun would know that the typical clip that comes on a Glock, which is a small handgun, I don't think anyone would see me with my Glock 17 and think, what a high capacity magazine. But because it carries 17 bullets, I think a lot of people hear that and they're like, oh my God, we absolutely have to ban this. The fact that you can modify your gun with simple hardware, like the hardware that comes on a belt, and create something that has the effect of what a bump stock unit would if you were to purchase it, it's a little bit ridiculous to think we should ban something like that. There are so many people who have used guns their entire lives, are familiar with the mechanics, and can very easily create guns from scratch. I've met people like this at the range in North Carolina. And so to think that just because a gun is even registered, that the government has the capacity and will look into someone's background if a gun is registered to someone and they're exhibiting strange behavior online. We have so many cases of the FBI having a gun registered to someone's name, seeing them exhibiting concerning behavior and making concerning statements, other people raising red flags about them, and them still doing nothing. So policy is only as good as it can be enforced. And I think to make something like this illegal is not only an infringement upon our rights, but even if it were illegal, it's not a policy that's very enforceable.
So often we see these purported gun regulations or gun restrictions as just not being based in reality. I mean, as you were saying, a Glock doesn't look as scary to people who are not familiar with guns as maybe an AR-15 does, but they can fire at the same rate. They can carry about the same amount of ammo. But we see these attempted bans on so-called assault weapons, which is not even a real definition. It's different all the time depending on who introduces the legislation. And the assault weapon is just a black gun that has some accessories on it, essentially, that make it more comfortable to shoot. It doesn't have anything to do with the guns being more powerful or more apt to killing people or whatever it is that the left comes up with. And I think you also raise a really important point about how our gun laws are only as good as the enforcement, because we see a lot of people getting off on gun charges nowadays, and then we wonder why we continue to have gun violence. I mean, the whole point is that you should be cracking down on illegal gun owners and not punishing legal gun owners for their actions. And I think the Hunter Biden case was a perfect example of how the system should work, right? He clearly lied on the federal form about his drug abuse. He had the firearm in his possession when multiple witnesses and digital communications proved that he was still addicted to drugs at the time. And he was prosecuted and he was convicted by a jury of his peers. So that's how it should work, is if somebody is lying on a background check or keeping a gun despite failing a background check or misusing it in some way, then they should be prosecuted, absolutely. But let's focus on that before we start implementing these new restrictions that really only affect legal gun owners, not illegal ones.
I'm not really surprised at the court's ruling on this one, especially that it's a 6-3 decision along ideological lines, to have, Sotomayor, Kagan, and Ketanji Brown Jackson on the, dissenting side of this. It's interesting. It highlights to me the difference in the United States between who is a liberal and who is on the left, because so many people who are leftists who feel like they are anti-capitalist, some are for the gun control legislation and more restrictions, but I think most of them have studied CIA history, have studied FBI history, have studied the cases where workers were striking for more rights and the government used militarized police against them. There's just enough cases where I think that's what leads the left to feel we do need to protect ourselves from the government. But there's definitely a comfortable group of people that cannot even fathom what it would be like to require weapons to protect themselves, because they live in safe communities, because they feel like we have generally a good society and they're not experiencing a lot of the economic hardships that the majority of America does. And unfortunately, that group of people is very loud in media. And of course, it's sad whenever there's a mass shooting, whenever someone uses this kind of technology to just do senseless evil. But I think we have to put this in the greater context of what freedoms would we lose as a country were we to make these restrictions? And if we made those restrictions, would it address the problem we're most upset about? And I think putting yourself in other people's shoes and having that kind of empathy is important when making policy and when, applying the Constitution and interpreting the laws.
Yeah, I mean, even just consider people who live in rural America, even if they do generally have trust in their local police department, the response time is often way higher than it would take for them to lose their lives in an act of violence. So another great reason why there are so many legal gun owners in this country. We're going to take a break, be back with more Rising after this.